Welcome to Let's Talk Death, conversations to inform and inspire. Let's Talk Death is a series of conversations with some amazing people from various fields. Our goal through these conversations is to normalize, educate, and demystify the taboo around death, dying, and the journey of grief. Hello, welcome to this episode of Let's Talk Death. I'm Fran Solomon.
And I'm Andy McNeil.
And we're thrilled to be your host for these conversations. Let's Talk Death is brought to you by Heal Grief, a social support network creating community after someone has died. Everything we do is inspired by our core belief that no one should ever grieve alone.
Our goal with this program is to have a friendly chat with some amazing people so we can help normalize and educate the Heal Grief community. Our guest today is Robert Kabacy. Robert has been a lawyer in the estate planning and wealth transfer industries for more than 25 years. After his mother's death, he experienced firsthand the difficulties of navigating the legal complexities of her estate and doing so while grieving. As a result, he wrote and developed a guide titled About Me, Information You Will Need When I've Passed. Robert enjoys reading, stage parlor magic, outdoor activities, and swims almost daily in his spare time. Robert, we are delighted to have you as a guest on our show.
Thank you for being here, and thank you, Andy, and thank you, Fran, for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to reach out to your listeners.
Yeah, Robert, so let me ask you, before we speak about your book, may I ask you to go back in time and share a bit about your experience that actually inspired you to write about me?
Yes, it's interesting. I knew statistically that in terms of emotional hardship in life, we all face stressors, and death is a stressor that we all face, with some of the top ones being death of a spouse, death of a child, but also death of a parent. And I knew that as an estate planning lawyer, but what I didn't know was the traumatic impact the loss and death of a loved one really has on an individual, because I've faced it with a lot of my clients, but I was the mechanic involved, never the subject of the grieving. When my mother passed away, even though I've been trained in the estate planning world and know what to do in my sleep, it was an emotional, overwhelming experience that was very, very difficult. And surprisingly, immediately following her death, I really didn't know what to do. And fortunately, I had taken some notes and jotted some notes down ahead of time and went directly to those notes just for a guide, just so that I had some security in this time of immense loss. Having those notes really helped me kind of get going as to what the next steps were and what I needed to do. Even though I should have known, I didn't know. And the reason is because grieving can be emotionally overwhelming for all of us. It's part of the human condition.
Yeah, grief impacts really all of who we are. It's an experience we're living, and it includes our minds. It impacts our ability. We call it like a brain fog that we get, and we just, things that we would ordinarily know or do or just be able to pull out of the recesses of our mind are not as readily accessible, really.
Yeah. And Andy, it's interesting. Now, I'm not a psychologist by any means, but I do read a lot. I do have a degree in psychology. But, this kind of study of grief went way back to 1969 with the 5 stages of grief that I'm sure your listeners may be familiar with denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then acceptance. But I think what we're learning now is that a lot of grief has to do with reprogramming the mapping that our brain does. And to reprogram the mapping in our brain requires a lot of emotional activity and, surprisingly, a lot of physical activity as well. I found myself very tired after the death of my mother frequently. And it's because we're having to remap our brains as a result of a loss. And that happens in any type of loss, but you really lump on the emotional aspect of the loss of a loved one into it, and it just becomes sometimes overwhelming.
Very, very tremendously. I know an equivalent in the bereavement field. Many of us as bereavement professionals, when we've had personal losses, here we are, people who supposedly know what to do to take care of ourselves and be healthy and work through our grief. But when it's personal, so there's that added personal nature as well. There's, like you're talking about, the impact that it has emotionally and mentally and even physically on our lives. But then there is this, when it is personal in nature, when we're the person who's on the inside looking out, quite often it does become challenging to say, well, wait a minute, what have I been telling other people? And how do I apply that to my own situation? Yeah.
Right. Well, and the thing that it brought to me was a sense of empathy and understanding that with the loss, you don't have a guide anymore to help you through. Your brain's in the process of remapping, and to have some guide to help you as to what the steps are that you need to do is what I found very helpful. And I came to the conclusion, if this was happening to me, it's happening to everybody. And with someone who's trained and not knowing what to do, how about someone who's not trained? Boy, if I can help them with my experiences, that's what I'd like to do with this process.
Robert, I have a question before we dive into the book. You said something just now that it helped develop a bit more empathy. How does that translate to the way you are now helping your clients? How is it different than before you had your experience?
So in this field, obviously there's a lot of feelings, but it allows me to put myself in their shoes and understand what they're feeling instead of going through a mechanical step-by-step process. It's one thing to talk about probate and the steps of filing a petition and posting a bond and publishing notice in the paper and waiting the creditor waiting period. Those are all mechanical features, but it didn't, until I really experienced it, allow me to understand what the clients were feeling and understanding that those feelings are valid and watching them at different stages during the engagement. Sometimes they would come in and they were angry, and sometimes they would come in and they have finally accepted. Last week, I had a client come in, total acceptance, and started remembering all the good things about the loss of their spouse, as opposed to a prior meeting where they were very angry about what was going on with their spouse. So understanding the emotional roller coaster that follows the loss is something that's allowed me to practice a little bit better.
Yeah, and I was fortunate enough to have a copy, an e-copy of the guide, the book. Very impressed. I want our listeners to know I was very, very impressed by it. And what struck me a bit, which we often hear that family relationships change because there's a lot of fighting that goes on with everybody having their own idea of what their person would have wanted.
Yes.
Your guide is a barrier to that. It gives the person who is dying or who will be dying, we're all going to die, that opportunity to explicitly lay out their wishes so that there's no room for interpretation.
That's right. It's not a substitute for good legal documents, however. No. So this book is not that. It's all the practical, non-legal things that go along with the loss of a loved one. It's a good complement to the legal documents that express what the person wanted to do. But what it does is it helps guide the family. Now, in some families, disputes are probably going to arise regardless of what preparations are done. But I think you're right. This book will help alleviate some of those and try to shift the focus back to understanding the grieving process as opposed to trying to take out anger through a legal process. fighting among heirs. Because I tell my clients, you know, after the loss of a matriarch or patriarch, you only have each other left, and you have the choice to support each other, or you have the choice to destroy those relationships, but it is a choice. Please don't let the grieving process interfere with that choice. Now, there may be other reasons for not to have a relationship, but try not to let death or a loss be the catalyst that causes that.
Yeah. I will tell you, Robert, I can't tell you how many people I've sat with over the years who are bereaved, and how many have said to me, whether it's in support groups or in one-on-one support, who have said, man, I wish someone would just write a guide. I just need a guide. I didn't expect all of this. And I'm trying to sort through it. We even have at Heal Grief, we have, of course, adults of all ages that we're providing support for. Especially, we even have young adults, people in their early 20s who now are the person who's handling estates, and it comes up all the time. And the question to us is there something out there that's just a step by step? Because it doesn't exist. So in a lot of ways, what you've done is you have written the very document that people have asked me for years. People have asked for this guide.
Yes, and it was out of necessity for my own situation, as opposed to, you know, trying to help my clients. And it's worked out to help everybody that has come into contact with it. It's a good guidebook that allows people to really get information that they need in their time of need.
So what are some of the sections and resources and tips that readers might find in your book?
Yeah, the book is divided into 3 sections. The first section is a customizable fill-in section that asks you questions and allows you to identify information about yourself. It's easy to fill out. It contains all the non-legal information and even some tips about getting your legal documents done as well. The second section is a chapter-based narrative section that talks about the administration process, what is probate, how to handle grief, what if disputes arise, and a variety of other topics. The third section is a resource guide with helpful websites and telephone numbers that people can turn to when they need something. A couple of things about the book that are interesting is, one, I wanted to make sure that it laid flat so that you didn't have to put your arms or hands on it, because I found that when you're working through the administration process, you need both hands to be on the phone and to be writing, and the last thing you need is books folding up on each other. So that's a very important thing. The second thing is the title is kind of a funny story. I thought of the title, and I brought it home to my wife and said, I've got the perfect title for the book as we were editing it. I said, it's about me. And she said, Bob, no one wants to read a book about you. And I said, come on, you don't really mean that. And we laughed. And the title is really, it's about the person who finds it. And I chose that title because when you walk into the room after the loss of a loved one and there's a book on the shelf that says about me, you're going to go right for that book. Interestingly enough, this is one of the few books, I can't even name another one, where the author's name does not appear anywhere on the cover. That I insisted on that because it's about the other person, not about the author here.
Title is a personalization of the content of the book.
Correct. Exactly.
Yeah.
Interesting. And do you think that this is a book that an individual does on their own or with family?
It's either. Doing it on your own can be a very cathartic experience for the individual, knowing that they're not going to leave problems behind. But doing it with family as well can be important, just to involve them in the process. Because as we know, grieving and death are not talked about in school. It's something we all face as human beings, and unfortunately, it's not taught to us as a natural part of living. And as a result, I encourage people to bring up the topic because it is going to happen. if it wasn't going to happen to all of us, we shouldn't talk about it. But given it is going to happen to all of us, why are we not talking about it? And I've learned that it's because it's our ego's desire to survive and not want to face that we are going to not be here one day.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
of my work, we do talk about it. And I found out that should my husband die before me, he wants a Chinese dinner. And we're Jewish. I would have done the Jewish deli bagels, but now I know it's a Chinese dinner.
Yeah.
And my children know that my color for the last decade has been cobalt blue, and that's the lining of my coffin. And that anybody coming to pay respects has to wear cobalt blue. So Andy, keep a note on that.
Right
and hopefully when they see cobalt blue, they'll just smile and that's mom.
Yeah, yeah, great.
I love that. You know, it is interesting. You talk about that we don't teach it in school. And we really, what's interesting though, is what we do in school is many of the stories that are read, many of the, in literature, really, if in any given literature class, history class, you pick it, there are stories of death and dying. And we learn about them in stories, we learn about them from a distance, but they're not personalized in that term. They're stories that we're watching. Kids entertainment, Disney, all of the Disney characters are bereaved. All of them have had someone in their life die, but that's not the main focus of the story. It's a side story typically, and then they're working through other things. But it is an interesting thing that we don't spend the time to really talk about and think about what that looks like and what that means to us as human beings, and truly preparing ourselves for that reality. We just don't do it.
We don't.
I just find it a gift for someone to leave for their family. A true gift, taking the guesswork out, letting family begin that journey of healing as opposed to wondering.
Exactly. And having something tangible that they can point to. It's a good memory of them as well. So it's a valuable book, and you're right. It brings the personalization of the process to the family as opposed to trying to figure it out from a fictional story.
Yeah, very much. Well, Robert, we're just about out of time, but before we end our time, I would like to give you an opportunity. Many of our viewers like to know how they can connect with our guests, how they can connect with your guide, with your book. If someone's interested in making those connections, how might they go about doing that?
So I've got a website, robertkabacy.com, that they can simply email me if they choose. Also, I want to thank my publisher, Beyond Words Publishing, who did it, and the distributor, Simon & Schuster. It's available on Amazon. Recently, I'm told it's on the charts on the legal side on Amazon, so I'm pleased about that. But certainly, listeners, feel free to reach out. We'll try to respond to you. I also have a full-time practice as well. So if I don't get back to you right away, my apologies. But that's one way to locate not only the book, but also reach out direct to me.
Great.
Robert, we'll have a link to the Amazon page on our website. And we want to thank you so much for being a guest here at Let's Talk Death and for sharing the story behind your book.
Thank you. It was a pleasure being on here, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to both you and your listeners and viewers.
Great. And we also want to thank those who are joining us for this episode of Let's Talk Death. If you would like to learn more about Heal Grief, please visit us at healgrief.org. At healgrief.org, you can learn more about all of the programs and resources of Heal Grief, including our national network of support for grieving young adults called Actively Moving Forward.
And if you know of a bereaved adult, refer them to our AMF app, where adults of all ages connect with others experiencing a similar death loss. And last, make sure to sign up on healgrief.org to receive our newsletter for links to future episodes of Let's Talk Death.
So with that, again, we thank you for joining us, and we will see you next time on Let's Talk Death.